In 1961, I traveled to observe the public proceedings involving Adolf Eichmann for a magazine assignment. Eichmann had been the official responsible for the complex logistics of transport during the conflict. He had been located in Argentina, brought to the region, and placed on the public stage to answer for his administrative role. I went, I confess, expecting to see a fanatic. That is what everyone expected. The presenters expected it. The audience expected it. A person burning with ideological hostility. That is the kind of figure we know how to recognize. That is the kind of behavior that makes sense to us. What I found in that glass booth was something far more disturbing. A middle-aged, ordinary individual with nearsighted eyes and clumsy speech. A former salesman who had joined a powerful bureaucracy and risen to prominence not through personal malice, hatred, or cruelty, through diligence, through obedience, through a remarkable, terrifying inability to think for himself. 6 psychiatrists certified him as normal. One of them remarked, and I find this almost funny, that Eichmann was more normal than I am after having examined him. His attitude toward his family was described as not only normal, but most desirable. The minister who visited him in prison declared him a man of very positive ideas, and this was the man who sent millions to their deaths. The longer I listened to him, the more obvious it became. Eichmann was not stupid. That is not the point. He was simply, genuinely, completely incapable of thinking from the standpoint of anyone else. He spoke exclusively in clichés, in what he himself called officialese. When he tried to construct a sentence of his own, he would repeat it until it too became a cliché. He was surrounded as if by armor, by stock phrases that insulated him entirely from reality. This is what I mean by the banality of evil. Not that evil is ordinary or unimportant, not that it is excusable, but that it can be committed on a massive scale with bureaucratic precision by someone who is not motivated by hatred or ideology or psychopathy, by someone who simply stopped thinking, stopped asking, what am I doing, to whom? On January 20, 1942, in a villa outside Berlin, in a suburb called Wannsee, 15 high officials of the Nazi state met for a conference. Reinhard Heydrich had called them together to coordinate the implementation of what was already being called the final solution. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, then drinks were served and they had lunch. What struck Eichmann, who attended as secretary, was not the horror of what was being planned, it was the relief. He had harbored, he later admitted, some doubts about such a bloody solution through violence, but here, at this table, were the senior representatives of the entire German civil service, lawyers, undersecretaries, senior party officials, the popes of the Third Reich, he called them. And they were not merely agreeing, they were enthusiastic, they were competing for the honor of taking the lead. Eichmann said he felt a kind of Pontius Pilate feeling. He felt free of all guilt. Who was he, a mere lieutenant colonel, to judge when men so far above him had already decided? This is how institutions commit murder, not by forcing individuals to kill, but by relieving them of the burden of their own judgment. I must speak of something that cost me more than anything else I wrote in this book, and that earned me the most furious condemnation: the role of the Jewish councils, the Judenräte. In nearly every occupied country, the Nazis required the established Jewish leadership to administer the destruction of their own communities. They compiled the lists, they distributed the yellow stars, they organized the assembly points for deportation. They cooperated, in many cases not from cowardice, but from a tragic, catastrophically mistaken belief that cooperation would save some, that controlled compliance would prevent worse. 100 victims sacrificed to save 1,000, 1,000 to save 10,000. This is the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. I am not saying these men were evil. I am saying something harder, that without this cooperation, the machinery of murder could not have functioned with such terrible efficiency. And that this is part of the truth, a truth we owe the dead, however painful it is to speak. Eichmann was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He was hanged in May 1962. Before he died, he said, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I shall not forget them." He then added, calmly, with what he seemed to consider dignity, "We all must die." He had misremembered or borrowed a line from a play, apparently unaware of the irony that in the play the speaker is drunk. Even at the end he could not escape the cliché. The court was right to hang him. My quarrel was never with the verdict. It was with the framing, with the political theater that surrounded the trial, with the attempt to turn it into a lesson about the eternal persecution of the Jews, when what it actually revealed was something universal and therefore more terrifying, that ordinary men, functioning within ordinary institutions, can perpetrate extraordinary evil, not by becoming monsters, but by ceasing to think. This is the question Jerusalem left open, not how do we punish the guilty, but how does an entire civilization produce men for whom obedience replaces conscience? How do we guard against that? Eichmann is dead, but the conditions that made Eichmann possible, the bureaucracy, the language rules, the relief of personal judgment, those are not gone. They are never far away.